in there! Mine! Nobody move!
Three men kicked in the door of Earl's Diner on a Tuesday morning that started out like every other. The kind of morning where the coffee's already hot before the sun decides to show up, where the bacon grease smell hangs in the air like a welcome mat for tired souls. And then, the door flew open. They didn't walk in, they announced themselves. One boot through a wooden chair just to make sure everybody in the room understood the terms. The second man dragged his hand clean down the length of the counter, knocking over ketchup bottles, napkin holders, a little plastic flower Sarah had set there herself that first week on the job, because she said every place deserves something pretty. The third one grabbed Sarah. He didn't ask her to move. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He took her arm and threw her, and she hit the edge of that counter hard enough that her knees buckled, and she went down. That's when Earl Dawson set the spatula down. Not fast, not dramatic, slow. The way a man sets something down when he's already made up his mind about what comes next. He came around the end of the counter the same way he did everything, like he had all the time in the world. Like three men half his age, with fists ready to swing, were nothing more than a minor inconvenience on a Tuesday morning. The shaved head one saw him coming and laughed out loud. An old man, in a flour-dusted apron, walking toward three of them like he had any business doing that. He stopped laughing about 4 seconds later. Earl gave him exactly one chance. Stopped there, stood still 1 beat longer than he needed to, and said it quiet as a man ordering pie. "Walk out now." And we forget this happened. The kid swung instead. Wide fast, built to put Earl on the floor. Earl let it come. Watched that fist travel the whole distance, and at the very last second tilted his head exactly 3 inches to the left. The punch hit nothing but air. Before that kid even understood what had happened, Earl's hand was already closing around the back of his neck. One motion. The kid's face met the edge of a table. He did not get back up. The other two froze. 1 full second of silence in that diner. Nothing but the coffee pot still hissing on the burner, doing its job like nothing in the world had changed. Then the second one grabbed a chair, because somebody had to do something. And Earl Dawson, 67 years old, shifted his weight the way a man does right before he stops waiting. But let's slow down for a second, before we get to the rest of it, because you need to understand who that old man actually was before you watch what he does next. Earl Dawson had opened that diner at 5 o'clock every morning for 19 years straight. Rain or shine, winter or summer. By the time the first trucker walked through the door, the place already smelled like black coffee and something worth stopping for. In a town like Millbrook, Ohio, that kind of reliability was sacred. People don't talk much about the things that hold a small town together. The diner at the edge of the road that's always there. The guy behind the counter who knows your order before you sit down. Those things matter more than anyone admits until they're gone. Earl was a big man. Not Jim big, life big. The kind of size that settles into a man's bones after decades of hard living and never quite leaves. Gray hair cut close, beard trimmed neat. Quiet, mostly. But when Earl Dawson spoke, people leaned in without knowing why. Sarah Mills had walked into that diner 8 months earlier looking for work. 24 years old. Sharp eyes that had already learned not to trust too fast. Earl hadn't asked her much. He'd handed her an apron and a key to the back door, and not once in 8 months had he raised his voice at her. Not once. Millbrook had been a quiet town for a long time. Then, the Black Vipers moved in. They called themselves that. Young men. Mean in the particular way that young men get mean when they discover a shortcut to feeling powerful. Their operation was simple and ugly. Walk into a small business. Explain calmly that the neighborhood had gotten dangerous lately. Offer protection for a modest weekly fee. The hardware store paid first. The laundromat went next. The tire shop held out almost a full month until a brick went through their front window at 2 in the morning. By the time autumn rolled around, every business on that strip was sliding an envelope across a counter every Friday. Nobody fought it. Fighting it meant broken windows, or worse. Their leader called himself Curtis Lane, 27 years old, tattoos climbing both sides of his neck, a smile that never once made it all the way to his eyes. People who'd known him longer said he'd grown up watching his father get pushed around by every landlord in 3 counties, never once pushing back. And Curtis had decided early on that he would build something his father never had. He built fear instead of respect, because fear is faster. 3 days before that Tuesday morning, Curtis Lane walked through Earl's front door for the very first time. 2 of his guys trailed behind. They sat at the counter, spun the stools, put their boots up where the coffee cups belong. Curtis looked around, took in the old photographs on the walls, the regulars who had suddenly gone very quiet. Then he looked at Earl and smiled. He said the neighborhood had gotten dangerous lately, said for $200 a week, he'd personally make sure nothing happened to such a nice old place. Earl poured 3 cups of coffee, slid them across the counter without charging a cent. Then he said exactly 1 word. No. The whole diner went still. Curtis's smile flickered, just for a second. Like a candle in a draft it didn't see coming. He wasn't used to that word. Most men who told Curtis Lane no said it with their hands shaking, their voice catching in their throat, their eyes already apologizing before their mouth finished the sentence. Earl's voice didn't shake at all. Curtis laughed it off, said he'd swing by in a few days, let Earl think it over. Then he and his boys walked out, and every person in that diner let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. Sarah came over once the door closed. She was scared and not hiding it. She told Earl that maybe they should just pay. $200 wasn't worth somebody getting hurt over. Earl wiped down the counter, told her not to worry, said men like that always talked a lot bigger than they actually hit. He believed that. Mostly. But Earl Dawson also knew with a clarity that sometimes surprised even himself exactly what kind of storm was rolling in. He let Sarah keep believing it might pass, because that's the small mercy you give someone who's already carrying more fear than they should have to. What he didn't tell her was that he'd already made his decision the moment Curtis Lane walked back out that door. He just hoped it wouldn't have to come to it. It came to it. Above the register hung a single photograph. A much younger Earl, standing beside a row of motorcycles with men whose names he'd never once said out loud inside that diner. Sarah had asked about it once. He'd told her those were men he used to know. Brothers, in the way that word means something different after you've bled beside somebody. He'd said, I miss who I was around them, not what we did. She hadn't fully understood what he meant. Not then. She would. Before the week was over. 3 quiet days passed. Earl almost convinced himself Curtis had moved on, found an easier target. Written off Millbrook as not worth the trouble. Then Tuesday morning arrived. The boot through the glass, the chairs, Sarah hitting the floor. Curtis hadn't come himself, too smart for that. He'd sent 3 of his crew instead. The ones who liked the work a little too much. They came in loud, because Loud had worked on every other business on that strip. Every diner, every shop, every small family operation that had spent years building something, only to have it taken apart in an afternoon. They had no idea they'd just walked into the one place in Millbrook where Loud wasn't going to be enough. The one with the chair swung first. A wide overhead arc built to put Earl down hard. Earl stepped inside the swing instead. Close enough that the chair came down across his back rather than the back of his skull. While that man was still finishing a swing that had already failed, Earl drove a fist up under his ribs. The chair clattered to the floor from fingers that had forgotten what they were holding. The last one threw a punch built entirely out of panic. Earl leaned away, caught him by the collar, and walked him straight through what was left of the front door. The glass that hadn't already come down came down. 9 seconds. Maybe 10. 3 grown men on the floor or out on the sidewalk. And 1 old man in a flour-dusted apron who wasn't even breathing hard. Someone in the diner laughed. That nervous kind of laugh that escapes a body the moment it believes it's safe again. Earl helped Sarah up first. Checked the cut above her elbow with the same quiet attention he'd give a customer's broken mug. Then he looked down at the 3 of them and told them, calm as a man reading a weather report, to crawl back to Curtis Lane and let him know the diner wasn't paying. Not this week. Not ever. They went, limping, not one of them looking back. Earl swept the glass himself, told the regulars breakfast was on the house, sat Sarah down at the counter, and poured her a coffee she hadn't asked for. The room filled back up with low voices, everybody already turning 9 seconds of something extraordinary into a story they'd tell for the next 20 years. Earl poured himself a coffee, sat down, rolled a shoulder that still carried an old ache from somewhere he didn't talk about, and let out a long breath that had clearly been waiting its turn for a while. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be. Most days. A tired man who'd handled a little trouble and was ready to put it behind him. Sarah asked him, voice low, where a man learns to move like that. Earl smiled. Just barely. Said it was a long time ago. Said it didn't matter anymore. He believed every word of that when he said it. He was wrong. The worst of that morning hadn't even introduced itself yet. The phone behind the counter rang. Earl let it go twice, then picked it up, listened, said nothing, and whatever easy, settled look had been resting on his face packed up and left for good. A voice on the other end said his full name, Earl Dawson. Then it said something that made him set his coffee cup down slower than he'd set anything down in years. We know who you are now. Here's what had happened in the 20 minutes since those 3 men limped out the door. They'd made it back to Curtis Lane, and Curtis had been furious. But somewhere in the middle of that fury, one of the older men on the crew, a man who'd ridden with rougher company long before Curtis, was old enough to shave, heard the description of the diner, and went the color of old paper. Because that older man remembered a name from a long way back. Back when the real clubs ran those highways. Back when the wrong patch on a man's jacket could clear out a bar in under 10 seconds. There had been exactly one name people said quietly back then. Like saying it too loud might summon something. Dawson. And just like that, the whole shape of that Tuesday morning changed completely. This stopped being about $200 a week the instant that crew understood who Earl Dawson actually was. The job turned into something a great deal colder. A name like that, alive and breathing, where half the town could watch him put down 3 of their men and walk away without a scratch. That wasn't a problem they could leave standing. If word got out that the Black Vipers got humiliated by one old man and did nothing about it, the whole operation was finished by Friday. So it stopped being a shakedown, it became a cleanup. The voice on the phone told Earl they were coming back, all of them this time, and there would be no witnesses left standing to talk about it afterward. Then it hung up. Earl stood there holding a dead phone, and for the first time all morning, he understood exactly how much time he had left, and exactly how little that was. He didn't panic. 40 years seemed to melt off him in roughly 3 seconds flat, and what stood underneath was the man he'd spent 2 decades trying to bury under aprons and quiet Tuesday mornings, and the simple, honest work of feeding people. He told the regulars, in a voice that left absolutely zero room for argument, to go out the back right now and not come back today. They went, without a single word. Then there was Sarah. He told her to go too. Take the truck, drive to her cousin's place 2 towns over. Don't stop. She didn't move an inch. She stood right there in the middle of the wreckage and told him she wasn't leaving him alone with whatever was coming. Earl didn't argue. He walked into the back office instead, came out holding a small steel box, set it on the counter, opened it, and took out a single object. A patch. Old leather, edges gone soft and frayed, the kind you earn and bleed for, and that men have died over before they ever got the chance to wear it. He didn't explain what it meant. He didn't have to. Sarah had grown up in this part of the country, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. All at once, everything came into focus. The photograph above the register, the way he'd moved, the quiet, the absolute certainty in everything he did. She understood that the quiet man who'd handed her a job and never once asked about her past had once stood near the very top of a world she'd only ever heard about in whispers. He told her gently that he needed her gone, not out of fear for himself, but because he didn't want her watching him become that man again. He'd spent 40 years walking away from who he used to be, and he didn't want that to be the last picture of him she carried. Sarah took the keys. She drove as far as the gas station across the road, parked under the awning, and sat there, hands on the wheel, shaking, because some part of her simply could not make the rest of her leave him completely. Earl locked the back door, righted the broken chairs, reached under the counter to something he'd checked every single morning for 19 years and never once needed, and he waited. Out on the road you could already hear them coming, a line of engines, low at first, then climbing. The sound of a great many men arriving with no plan to leave anybody behind who could talk about it later. Earl stood behind his counter, hands flat against the wood, in the exact same spot he'd stood 3 days earlier when Curtis Lane had smiled at him and thought he'd found an easy mark. 67 years old, outnumbered better than 10 to 1, and still by a wide margin the most dangerous thing within 500 miles of that diner. The first engine cut out right outside, then another, then the rest. They came in slower than the first crew had, and that told Earl everything he needed to know. This group had been briefed. They knew who they were walking in on, and men who know exactly what they're walking into and walk in anyway are a different breed of dangerous entirely. Curtis Lane came in last. He stepped over the broken glass and looked across the counter at Earl. The soft smile from 3 days ago was completely gone, replaced by something tighter, more careful. 11 of them in the end, more than half carrying something. A bat, a length of chain. One man carrying something heavier in his waistband that he hadn't pulled out yet, and one old man behind a counter in a flour-dusted apron. Curtis tried talking first, told Earl he hadn't known who he was dealing with. Said maybe they could still work something out, find some arrangement everybody could live with. But even as the words left his mouth, his crew kept moving, spreading along the walls, boxing the room in from 3 directions. Earl watched the spread, and understood every word out of Curtis's mouth was nothing but noise, a distraction. So Earl didn't answer the words, he answered the movement. The man easing toward his right side with a length of chain was the real threat, and Earl knew it before the man had even finished deciding to move. Earl came over the top of his own counter, faster than any of them believed a man his age could possibly move. One short, brutal strike to the throat, and the chain man folded straight to the floor. The room exploded. The first fight had been 9 seconds, gone almost before it started. Clean and fast like flipping a switch. This one was not fast. This one was a war. 11 men couldn't all reach him at once in a room that narrow. And that single fact was the only thing keeping Earl alive. He put his back to the counter so they could only come at him from the front, made every single one of them pay full price. A bat came down across his shoulder instead of his skull. His whole left arm went half numb. He kept moving anyway. His body told him with every joint screaming exactly what his mind already knew. He wasn't the man he'd been at 30. Every impact cost more than it used to. Recovery time he didn't have. But 40 years hadn't taken the one thing that had always mattered most about Earl Dawson in a fight. The man simply did not stop. He broke a man's forearm, drove another head first into the pastry case, caught a wrist with a knife in it and turned it the wrong direction, and watched the blade hit the tile. Then a length of pipe caught him flush across the back of the skull. He hadn't fully seen that one coming. For one long, terrible second, the whole diner tilted sideways. His knees buckled. Across the road at the gas station, Sarah had her hand pressed flat against the glass. She stopped breathing. Every man left standing believed they were about to watch Earl Dawson go down for good. So did Earl. He didn't go down. He found the edge of the counter with his palm, pulled himself back upright through nothing but pure, ugly, uncompromising will, and put down the man who'd swung that pipe with a single elbow that ended the question entirely. But he was bleeding badly now, slowing, and there were still 6 of them standing. That was when Curtis Lane, who'd been hanging back near the door this whole time, finally reached for what was tucked into his waistband. the gun came out. And every sound in that diner stopped at once. A gun changes a fight. It doesn't matter how skilled a man is, how big, how willing. Everything changes the moment a barrel points at you. Earl stood against his own counter, blood running down his chin, looking straight down the barrel held by a scared 27-year-old who had never once crossed that particular line before. Curtis's hand shook badly. He'd built an entire operation on noise and reputation and fear, and he had never actually had to pull a trigger on a living man. Now here he stood, facing the single most dangerous person he was ever going to meet in his life. The gun felt a great deal heavier than it had 10 seconds earlier. Earl spoke. Same quiet he'd used 3 days ago. The day one word had changed everything. He told Curtis that if he meant to pull that trigger, he'd better not miss, because the second that bullet failed to put him down, Earl was going to take that gun out of his hand and use it. And there would be no more talking after that. Not for Curtis. Not for a single one of the 6 men still on their feet. That was the moment the front door opened again. Sarah walked in. She'd had a clean, easy path to staying right where she was. Safe. Out of it. All she had to do was sit in that truck and wait. She got out anyway, crossed the road, walked straight into a room full of armed men. She didn't say much at first. She held Earl's old patch up high where everyone in that room could see it. And she said one thing loud and clear. She told them they all knew exactly what that patch meant. Told them the man whose name belonged on that patch was standing right there, bleeding, and that the people who'd given him that patch were still out there. And they did not forget their own. It was a bluff. And it wasn't a bluff. Every man in that diner had grown up on stories about that kind of loyalty, that kind of reach, and not one of them could say with any certainty that she was wrong. You could watch it land in real time. 6 hard, dangerous men, running the same calculation, and the math kept coming out wrong for every single one of them. The gun came down first. Curtis lowered it slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument his arm had been losing. There are doors a man doesn't open. There are men a man walks past on the street and counts himself lucky for it the rest of his life. Curtis Lane had kicked one of those doors clean off its hinges over $200 a week, and it had cost him nearly everything before 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Earl stepped forward and took the gun out of his hand. Curtis let him. It was over. Truly over, this time. The men who could still walk walked out. They left the way people leave a church, quiet, careful, nobody looking back. By the time police arrived, called by half the regulars Earl had sent home, there was nothing left but broken glass, dark stains on the tile. And one old man sitting on a stool with a split lip and a bag of frozen peas pressed against his shoulder. Curtis Lane was arrested at the scene, along with 6 of his crew. The investigation turned up 6 months of extortion records, security camera footage, and sworn statements from every business on that strip. The Black Vipers collapsed within a month. The hardware store stopped paying inside a week. The tire shop owner walked down personally and told whoever was left running things that he was done. He got no argument. Curtis went to prison. He wrote Sarah a letter from there about a year later. Earl never read it. But Sarah kept it folded in a drawer behind the register for the rest of her life. What she said once was that the letter hadn't asked for anything, hadn't explained itself, or made excuses, or handed her reasons why it wasn't really his fault. It had just said he was sorry, plainly, without trying to make it smaller than it was. She said it was the first time in her life anyone who'd hurt her had apologized, without also handing her a reason it wasn't really their fault. As for who Earl Dawson really used to be, the town mostly let it lie. A handful of the older folks had recognized the name the moment it surfaced, and they understood in their own quiet way why a man who'd once been what Earl Dawson had been might want to spend the second half of his life flipping eggs and pouring coffee and never once raising his voice at another living soul. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the world want more than almost anything else to be left alone in peace. They've already seen where the other road goes, and they know better than anyone alive that it doesn't lead anywhere worth following. Sarah stayed. She put the patch back in its steel box herself and handed it to Earl with both hands. Neither of them talked about that day much afterward, but something between them had shifted, permanently, in a way that never needed words to be real. She'd seen the man underneath the apron now, and what she felt afterward, instead of fear, was something closer to what a daughter feels for a father who's finally let her see the whole of him. She understood why he'd never once asked where she'd come from, or what she was running from. A man like Earl didn't need to ask a question like that. He'd spent a good part of his own life running from something too, and he'd finally found a place worth stopping. The diner reopened 3 days after that Tuesday morning. New glass in the door. The same faded photograph still hanging on the wall where it always had been. The regulars came back and brought friends. For a good long while, that little roadside diner in Millbrook, Ohio, stayed busier than it had been in all 19 years combined. Earl never cared much for the fuss. He poured their coffee, waved off their thanks, and slowly, over weeks and then months, the fuss wore itself down to something closer to normal. Life went back to being quiet, exactly the way Earl preferred it. Think back for a second to where this whole thing started. A boot through the glass, a young woman thrown to the floor. An old man setting down a spatula, slow and careful, like the act of putting it down mattered. It looked, in that very first moment, like a mismatch nobody could survive. It looked like the world doing what the world does too often, the strong taking from the weak, the young rolling over the old. But here's the thing about quiet men that the world keeps forgetting. The quiet isn't weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice, made deliberately. By somebody who's already been everywhere that violence can take a person, and decided on purpose to come back from it, and pour coffee instead. Curtis Lane looked at Earl Dawson that first morning and saw exactly what he wanted to see, an easy mark. What he should have seen was a man who had set down a very heavy burden a long time ago, who would pick it back up exactly once, for exactly the right reason, and then set it down again for good. Earl Dawson ran that roadside diner for another 11 years after that morning. He passed away quietly in his sleep in the small apartment above the place where he'd lived the whole time. Half the town turned out for the funeral. More people than Millbrook had seen gather in one place for as long as anyone could remember. Sarah, who by then had taken over running the diner herself, kept his stool empty behind the counter for years afterward. Never let a single person sit in it. And somewhere, in a steel box in the back office, there's still an old leather patch frayed at every edge that nobody has ever needed to take back out again. Because by then, everyone who needed to know already knew exactly who Earl Dawson had been, and exactly who he'd chosen to become instead. 11 years passed, and Earl Dawson never raised his voice at another living soul. He flipped eggs, he poured coffee before the sky picked a color, he listened to Sarah talk about her day, and never once brought up Curtis Lane's name unless she brought it up first. The steel box went back in the office. The patch went back in the box. And it sat there, year after year, untouched. The way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass, not forgotten, just no longer needed. Millbrook kept its quiet roadside diner. Earl kept his stool, his apron, and his mornings. That was the whole second half of his life, and he never once wanted it any other way. If you or someone you know is being threatened, intimidated, or pressured into so-called protection, you do not have to handle that alone. Contact your local law enforcement. And if you want to report a pattern of organized extortion, the FBI accepts tips at tips.fbi.gov. Available anytime, day or night. You don't need to have all the answers. You only need to make the call. If this story stayed with you, if there was a moment, a detail, something you can't quite shake, tell me about it. In the comments, I read every single one, and I want to know which part hit you hardest. If you're new here, welcome. Heart Tales is where stories like this live. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the quietest, most human ways possible. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, there are 2 more stories waiting for you right now on your screen. I think you'll want to stay. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring enough to make it all the way to the end. That matters more than you know.